Historically, Boba Fett is a character that I've always found intriguing. While I never developed a strong affinity for him, his narrative potential is something that has always been apparent to me. It's hard to deny that he's an intriguing figure, at least outside of his appearances in the movies, where his menacing presence set the franchise precedent of imposing characters in cool armor that ultimately do nothing of value, eventually getting a borderline comedic death that doesn't live up to their prospective hype. That said, Boba's extended universe depictions were always so much more robust and full of life. I specifically remember this one summer of my youth when I came across the Fight to Survive books, which chronicle his life directly after his father's death in Episode 2. In intimately detailing his search for Darth Tyrannus, you witness the progression of his character, watching Boba's naivety slowly get stripped away during his descent into the cruel underbelly of the Star Wars galaxy, losing what innocence he had and evolving into the more callous and ruthless figure we see during his on-screen moments in the Clone Wars TV series and later works in the chronology. It was fascinating seeing his more altruistic acts of kindness slowly be replaced by more cunning displays of ruthless pragmatism. So, when I heard that a series was being produced to further explore him after the events of the original trilogy, I was intrigued. The character's a hotbed for further analysis, and I was curious to see what route they would take. And, Disney immediately disappointed. Prior to the show, the decision was made to rename Boba's ship from its long-standing title as the Slave One to the Fire Spray, taken from the vehicle's in-universe model name. I understand why they made the decision. Smoothing out some of the rougher edges of the lore to make things a bit more child-friendly makes sense at face value. Because even though Star Wars has a huge adult fan base, the franchise at its core has generally been made to target a more adolescent audience. The name Slave One is incredibly charged and harkens to some of the less palatable aspects of real-world history, but I don't think that makes it an intrinsic endorsement of slavery as a real-world practice. The name does, however, tie directly into who Boba Fett is and some of the conflictions that come with his existence. Boba Fett is the first clone of Jango Fett, the only one not modified to age at an accelerated rate, the only one not programmed to be a militaristic workhorse, the only one to have a true modicum of freedom. The unsettling truth about the clones is that they are in form and function a slave race. They fit the definition of such a title as people forced to work and obey another, and they're considered to be property of the Republic. The clones have no true agency.
They are totally obedient, taking any order without question. We modified their genetic structure to make them less independent than the original host.
From birth, they are raised and indoctrinated into a military system that ultimately sees them as disposable. And due to their genetic engineering, they age at an accelerated rate. So even if they survive the war, they'll die shortly after due to old age, at about 40 or so years old, give or take. Boba's ship was a keepsake left for him by his father, one of the only mementos he had sans the style of armor he wears. The name, Slave One, is a cruel testament to his profession. Jango was a bounty hunter and trained his son to do the same, an occupation that is many ways only semantically different than being a slave catcher. And Boba steps into this grim legacy by becoming a frequent collaborator with the Empire, a militaristic authoritarian state whose foundation is built upon rights violations. One example, as shown in Andor, is that prisoners of the state are put in perpetual labor camps, kept there to work until they die. While escapism in media is a good thing to have access to, I think it's also important for art to be, at times, uncomfortable. In that, it allows us to tackle the more awful aspects of our own reality, pulling back the curtain and forcing viewers to confront complex topics, actively spurning them to learn and grow. When you have a story like Star Wars that in part centers around the destruction of a totalitarian empire, it's prudent to show the unsavory aspects of that empire, lest the people fall in love with the aesthetics of the regime, while ignoring the politics of the faction. The Empire was a brutal organization that not only utilized slave labor within its own prison camps, but also willfully aligned themselves with figures like Jabba the Hutt, who not only engaged in sex trafficking, but also chattel slavery as a whole. They were in no way good guys, and had no redeemable aspects. They were in no way cool. They were in no way something to aspire to, and their collaborators, such as Boba, are just as culpable in their atrocities as someone like Darth Vader. Star Wars fans seemingly forget this in their favoritism. Unfortunately, the Book of Boba Fett absentmindedly sidesteps this aspect of its namesake character to a major degree. Instead of taking the time to earnestly address the character's past, his actions, and the psychology of someone who would operate within these systems, the series opts to handwave away the heavier discussions of any guilt he may feel or any real recognition of the harm his actions cause to others. The Book of Boba Fett could have centered around the titular character attempting to navigate the post-Empire society, dealing with his reputation as a former Imperial collaborator and the stigma that comes with it. Maybe a narrative centered around him engaging with a former bounty he turned over to the regime, potentially someone who was falsely framed by the Empire and is now confronting Boba with the harm he caused to their life. Or alternatively, the show could have explored the idea of him feeling no remorse for his actions, his justifications for feeling that way, and what that looks like in earnest. The most we really get addressing any of this is Boba saying,
"Fate sometimes steps in to rescue the wretched."
and a few offhand quips from Cad Bane, a former associate.
"I don't negotiate with gutless murderers."
If that's not the quack to calling the stifling slimy. You gave it a shot. You tried to go straight, but you've got your father's blood pumping through your veins. You're a killer.
Statements that, had they been better supported by the narrative, would have been biting confrontations, but instead come off as petty daggers thrown by a spurned former associate. Star Wars seems to be more interested in doing self-referential lore callbacks instead of telling new, interesting stories. And in order to do that, Disney either can't or won't do anything that could besmirch the mental image that Boba's fans have of him. He's not a good guy. If not an outright villain, then maybe morally ambiguous at best. And I'm fine with that. In fact, I love when villains are allowed to be villains. What I hate is ham-fisted attempts at accelerated Zuko-esque redemption arcs, which is what the show opted to do. So instead of getting a tale unpacking any of the aforementioned themes, we get a story of Boba filling the power vacuum left by Jabba the Hutt, positioning himself as a more ethical mob boss. This is also juxtaposed with a sort of new sheriff in town, spaghetti western vibe, with a couple episodes that interweave a Last Samurai, I hung out with the indigenous people and found inner peace style narrative. This eventually culminates with Boba essentially doing an ayahuasca trip in the desert with the Tusken Raiders, solidifying his rebirth. He essentially becomes the Star Wars equivalent of one of those Silicon Valley tech bros who does DMT, speaks with a fifth-dimensional Mesoamerican god, and then comes to the conclusion that the meaning of life is to be a better capitalist. Narratively speaking, it seems like there wasn't a lot of confidence in this show's ability to carry itself. Out of the 7-episode season, 2 of them are Mandalorian side plot episodes used to bridge the gap between seasons 2 and 3 of that show. And the worst part is that these 2 episodes are the best part of Boba's series, if the viewer is interested in Din Djarin's tale. Otherwise, they're incredibly awkward and confusing for anyone viewing them outside of that context. The most frustrating aspect of this is that the 2 episodes heavily cut into Boba's arc. Episode 4 leaves a decent amount of yardage to cover story-wise, and it feels clear that the intent was initially to tie up some loose plot threads, but they kinda got swept under the rug as the series rushed into its finale. For example, in episode 4, Boba is gifted a baby Rancor and expresses the intent to ride it.
"I want to learn to ride this one."
You what?
To which Danny Trejo says that it'll take time to train it and develop a relationship with the beast.
"Teach me."
It will take a tremendous amount of discipline.
We never actually see this happen, and the next time we're graced with the Rancor's presence, Boba is bending corners on it like it's the finale of a Fast and Furious movie. It feels like the Book of Boba Fett wouldn't have been made if The Mandalorian didn't garner so much popularity, giving the powers that be a perfect opportunity to loosely tie Boba into that story, attempting to stoke the coals of his cultural relevancy. The whole thing is tonally conflicting. One second you're dealing with Boba doing some dances with wolves soul searching. The next scene he's getting punked out. The next scene we have a bit of slapstick comedy. Then we have a flashback to his childhood. Then we have Boba getting punked out again. Honestly, getting snuck by a Wookiee in your own crib is dirty work. They're like 8 feet tall and probably smell like wet dog. There's no reason any one of them should ever pass a stealth check. I get why Homie said this.
Well, with apologies, sir. No one respects you.
Another gripe I have with the series is that Boba is awkwardly incompetent. The logistics of his crime empire are almost completely handled by his second-in-command, while his only real input is throwing large sums of money at all of his problems.
We must prepare for war.
How much treasure do we have in reserve?
I have plenty of credits.
It feels like the show didn't quite know what it wanted to be. It feels unfocused in its intent. One of the narrative through lines of the show, whether intended or not, is that disaster follows Boba's wake. Throughout the story, almost every third party he interacts with meets a grim fate, and the story never takes a moment to really interrogate this trend. It just goes on to the next scene unceremoniously, but not as unceremoniously as I'm about to pivot into this Patreon plug. I wasn't quite sure how I wanted to end this essay, so I'll leave you with a quick thought. As I've come to ponder Boba more, he's become an increasingly more interesting figure to me. From his introduction into the zeitgeist to his unrelenting cultural relevancy, his life story is a fertile ground for narrative potential, and I'd like to humbly suggest a potential story. In the Obi-Wan show, there's a scene where Obi comes across an elderly clone trooper, now a homeless beggar discarded by the Empire post-Order 66.
Spare any credits.
Very reminiscent of the way America treated its Vietnam veterans, which is fitting because the factions in Star Wars were in some part based on those that formed the Vietnam War.
You did something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly.
While this scene, albeit short, did hit hard and I think was the best moment of that show, I think something akin to this would have hit harder with Boba Fett having a similar interaction. There were still some clones around at the time the Book of Boba takes place, and the show having a major or minor plotline where he interacts with one of his brothers would have been phenomenal. This hypothetical communion could have borne an introspective tale examining the juxtaposition between their lives, diving into the dichotomy of their lived experiences, a reconciliation of how, even though the circumstances of their birth may have been different, their respective professions were painfully similar, thus finding the common grounds within their personal accounts, functioning as a confessional for their sins, their crimes, and their individual and collective guilt, finding not only a sense of company and comfort within each other, but also providing the first real tender inklings of familial bond either would have felt since the Clone Wars, the cross-fertilization of their lives bearing fruit, allowing them to be born anew. The Eucharist not wholly absolving them of their transgressions, but at least helping them come to terms with them and move forwards as better men.